Did you just freely choose to watch this video? Or was it somehow written in your destiny that you were always going to be sitting there watching me at this moment in time? Right now, it probably feels like you decided to press play. But what we feel on the surface isn't always an accurate reflection of what's happening at a deeper level. In this video, I'm going to explore the question of whether we have free will or whether everything is predestined, by looking at some real-life examples, by drawing on the wisdom of yogic and Vedic philosophy, and by taking a fresh look at what freedom really means in light of the non-dual nature of reality. So I'm Catherine, and on this channel I share the insights that I gained from meditating and studying with a self-realized teacher in the Himalayas for 15 years. But about 35 years ago, before I'd met my guru or even imagined being on a spiritual path, my sister and I were traveling around India together, and we visited an astrologer in Benares who made some very specific predictions about my life. He told me exactly when I would meet my life partner and what kind of person he would be. He said I would have a guru, that I would become a teacher and a writer, and he even mentioned some health issues. At the time, none of this matched the story I had in my mind about my future. And by the way, I should mention I'm not particularly interested in astrology either. I've never had a reading since, and I'm not trying to persuade anyone about astrology in one way or another. But the fact is that over the years, everything has unfolded in precisely the way that the astrologer predicted. So then, if my life was always going to unfold in this way, if I was always going to be sitting here making this video and you were always going to be sitting there watching it, if we're just playing out the script of our lives that's already been written, what does this mean when we talk about individual freedom of choice or free will? There's a really interesting documentary that I watched a few years ago called My Reincarnation, which was filmed over about 20 years and follows the life of a boy called Yeshi, who's the son of the Tibetan Buddhist master Chogyal Namkhai Norbu. Yeshi's father escaped from the Chinese in Tibet and went to Italy, and Yeshi was born and brought up in Italy, but was recognized as the reincarnation of his great uncle, who was another great Dzogchen Buddhist teacher. And as a child, Yeshi himself has many vivid dreams of a village in Tibet, and his father tells him that he must return to Tibet and see the people who were his students in his previous incarnation. But Yeshi really resists the idea that he has to follow a certain path. He rebels against his father's tradition. He doesn't want the responsibility of being a teacher and decides that he just wants to live an ordinary Western life. And the interesting thing is that his father seems utterly unconcerned about Yeshi's choices. He doesn't try to persuade him of anything. He just leaves him to do what he wants because he's so convinced that Yeshi won't be able to avoid his destiny. So the documentary follows Yeshi as he grows up, and he ends up getting married and having a family and taking a job with a big computer company which involves long drives between different cities. And after a while, feeling pretty stressed out by his job, and just as something to relax him while he's in the car, he starts listening to Tibetan chants, and something about the music draws him in, and he slowly finds himself pulled back to the teachings and practices of Tibetan Buddhism. And eventually, the filmmaker follows him as he goes back to his family's village in Tibet for the first time. And there are some really touching scenes where the older villagers recognize him as the reincarnation of their teacher. And he realizes that this was the place that he had dreamed about so often when he was young. But what's really extraordinary is that it becomes clear that he'd been dreaming about the village as it was right then and there, not how it had been in the past. In other words, his childhood dreams had actually been of the future, which was now unfolding. So Yeshi comes full circle. He meets his destiny. It was inevitable. But the beautiful thing for me is that it's clear that this hasn't been against his will. It doesn't feel forced. You can see that he's gradually found his way back to something that actually feels deeply familiar and right, and that this has happened in exactly the amount of time that it was always going to take. So I'd like to point out something important here, which is that if we think of predestination as being the opposite of free will, we might mistakenly assume that it must feel like coercion, as if it's a destiny forced on us against our will, when actually it may just feel like living in harmony with our intrinsic nature, in alignment with our true calling. And living in alignment in this way actually can give a great sense of clarity and freedom. In Vedic philosophy, these predestined paths are said to be due to our Prārabdha karma. Prārabdha refers to the portion of karma that has been set in motion by previous events. The classical analogy for Prārabdha karma is of an arrow released from a bow. Once the arrow has left the bowstring, its direction and momentum have already been determined. So we could say that it's completing the trajectory of its destiny. The end point is its destination. It can't pause mid-air and choose a different path. It has to travel along the arc that's been fixed at the moment of its release. In a more modern analogy, on a billiards table, once the first ball is struck with a specific direction and force, the entire sequence of collisions that follows is already precisely determined by that first movement. So in the same way, your Prārabdha karma, which was the cause of your present circumstances, was set in motion in the past, and it can't be changed or avoided. It has to be lived out and experienced. But let's take a step back for a moment, because everything that I've been talking about so far could be said to be a description of the forces at play at the level of the cosmic laws of creation. But even this level of divine universal forces never touches the pure awareness, which is the true reality of our existence. And the essential nature of this reality is freedom. This is why when someone realizes themselves to be pure awareness alone, this is called moksha or liberation. And liberation isn't the gaining of freedom within the unfoldment of events. It's the recognition that what you truly are has never been bound by the events. So the arrow may be in flight, the balls on the table may be colliding according to precise laws, but you, as the awareness in which all of this appears, are untouched and always have been. And so it's by recognizing this freedom as our own essential nature that we truly become free, regardless of what appears to be happening. My friend Jagai, who does the Unborn podcast with me, has a great analogy for this. Imagine there are two men sitting in prison talking to one another on death row. One man is the prisoner, and the other is the warden of the prison. From the outside, they appear to be in exactly the same situation. They're both sitting in the same locked cell. But one man knows that he's bound, and the other knows that he's free. So the internal experience of these two men is totally different, even though it may appear that they're in an identical situation. So in this way, someone who's realized that they're free is never truly bound, regardless of the physical circumstances that they appear to be in. Because from the standpoint of awareness, there's never been any bondage. There can never be bondage. So from this perspective, freedom isn't the ability to rewrite the script. Freedom is the recognition that what you actually are isn't confined by the script at all. But perhaps some of you are thinking, well, that's all very well for someone who's liberated, but what about for me, who's identified with my body and mind? If the script is already written, doesn't this mean that I'm powerless and that there's no point in making any efforts to achieve anything because everything's predetermined anyway? But that would be a misunderstanding. Because while Prārabdha karma refers to karma that's already in motion, the arrow that's already been released, that's only part of the story. There's another kind of karma called Āgāmi karma that's the karma created by present action. This means that even if certain events are predetermined, how we meet those events as they unfold in the present shapes what comes next. So we may not be able to undo what's already been set in motion, but our present state of clarity or confusion has consequences. And the thing is that when we act or react from ignorance, which means from a strong identification with the limited ego sense, suffering tends to perpetuate itself. Whereas if action arises from true understanding, we experience a freedom and a lightness of being that's much more aligned with our true nature. So then the efforts we can make stop being about trying to desperately control events or create a particular outcome, and start being about aligning with truth in every moment, regardless of what we're facing. These teachings are illustrated really beautifully in the Bhagavad Gita. And if you're unfamiliar with the Gita, I've written a booklet introducing the main themes, which you can sign up for free in the description box below. But to briefly explain, at the very beginning of the Gita, in chapter 1, Arjuna is completely overwhelmed. Standing in the middle of a battlefield, he sees his relatives and friends and teachers on both sides of the battle and collapses in a state of confusion and despair. Even though he knows his cousin, who he's about to fight, is an evil bully who needs to be stopped for the good of humanity, he's afraid of the karmic consequences of the battle. He's afraid of what will happen in the future. So his inclination is to surrender and to walk away. But he asks Krishna, his charioteer, for guidance. And Krishna gives Arjuna great teachings on the reality of existence and on the techniques that are needed to unfold that knowledge. And then about halfway through the Gita, Krishna gives Arjuna the ability to see a cosmic vision. And in that vision, Arjuna sees time itself. He sees the warriors that he's about to fight already being killed. He sees that the outcome of the battle is already woven into the fabric of reality. In other words, the arrow is already in flight. But Krishna doesn't say to Arjuna, I've already decided what will happen, therefore you don't have to do anything. He says, these enemy warriors are already slain by me. Therefore arise and be my instrument, be my vehicle, act. So he's specifically telling Arjuna to act, not from the contracted sense of being an individual isolated doer, but to act from alignment with the deeper intelligence that's already at play. And then at the very end of the Gita, when all of the teachings have been given about karma yoga and meditation and the three gunas and so on, Krishna says to Arjuna, I have revealed to you the deepest truth. Reflect on this fully and then act as you see fit. So he gives Arjuna the complete freedom of choice. Not because the result of the battle depends on Arjuna's individual choice, but because the whole of the Gita has really been about the transformation of Arjuna's state of mind and the unfoldment of his inner freedom. So if Arjuna fights, it must be from a place of clarity and freedom, not out of a sense of obligation or fear. The battle in the Gita is the battle against the ignorance in our own minds. This is what needs to be defeated, and this is the real victory that's won in the Gita. So coming back to that question of whether you freely chose to watch this video, the answer is both yes and no. Yes, at the level of our lived human experience, choice operates. But also no, because that choice arose within an intricate web of causes and conditions already in motion, most of which we're completely unaware of. But the real question is, are you recognizing your intrinsic freedom here and now? Because this freedom extends far beyond any sense of individual choice. In fact, the very sense of individuality begins to dissolve when this freedom is realized. And what remains isn't a helpless person being pushed around by fate or a separate individual trying to run the show, but simply the pure open awareness in which both of those ideas appear. And that awareness is what you always have been, are now, and always will be. It's already free. So our practice is simply to recognize that freedom moment by moment.